Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Julia Dias Leite. I'm the CEO of the Brazilian Center for International Relations. I'm here with CEBRI Online in partnership with Fernando Henrique Cardoso Foundation. It's a great honor and a privilege to have with us Pascal Lamy. Welcome, Pascal. And also Pedro Malan, member of the Board of Trustees of CEBRI, and Sérgio Fausto, Executive Director from Fernando Henrique Cardoso Foundation. So welcome everyone. I'll pass now to Sérgio for his welcome remarks. Thank you.
Very, very brief remarks. Pascal, it's a real pleasure and honor to have you here. I will just say that in sign of appreciation for the fact that you have made the time to be here with us today, that we'll all be rooting for Paris Saint-Germain next Sunday against Bayern de Munich in the Champions League final. This is of the utmost importance to myself and to the Brazilian community, so be sure that you have our backing against Bayern de Munich on Sunday. So having said that, I will hand it over to Pedro Malan, who will certainly make an extraordinary and serious introduction of Pascal Lamy. You have to, your mic is off, Pedro.
Okay. Good morning to the audience. Good afternoon to you, Pascal. It's a pleasure to be here and sharing the screen with Sérgio, Fausto, and Julia Dias Leite, and of course with Pascal. I had the privilege of serving in 2 boards with Pascal over the last several years, and I have my admiration for him only grew even more after this experience of working together. Pascal's CV is a very, very long one, so I try to be brief because he prohibited to mention some things that I was intending to mention. So I was just going to say that our guest today became widely known throughout the whole world during his 8-year, 2-term tenure as Director General of the World Trade Organization from September 2005 to September 2013. Pascal is today the chair of the Paris Peace Forum, a very important organization. He's the emeritus president of the Jacques Delors Institute. And I couldn't refrain of saying something more in the sense that Pascal was already very well known in European circles, economic and political circles, because of his significant, successful professional career and his very active role in the very process of construction European integration. I had several examples here from his work with Jacques Delors, in Pierre Mauroy, his work as a trade commissioner, the European Commission trade negotiator, Sherpa to the G7, his role in the Crédit Lyonnais, but he prohibited me to go into this detail, so I'll stop here. He prohibited me to read the list of his books as well. It's a very long list, far long to read, but they clearly established what the French called his lieu de parole, lugar de fala, as we say here in Brazil now, as one of the great voices for European integration, international cooperation, and the importance of multilateralism. As you see, you will see and hear as I give Pascal the floor. He's going to make a brief presentation about the big picture. After he finishes, I'll pose to him 1 or 2 questions, and after that, Sérgio would come. And then after myself and Sérgio pose the questions, Julia would read the questions she will be receiving from the audience. So, Pascal, you have the floor. It's a pleasure and an honor and a privilege to have you here. Go ahead.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you for this introduction. Thanks to Julia for hosting this conversation, and thanks to Sérgio for his support on Sunday. I'm not very as good a specialist of football as he is, and as most Brazilians are. The only thing I know that is we will need a lot of support to win this game. So if Brazil on the whole is with us, this may help a bit. Okay, as announced by Pedro, I'll start this conversation with a sort of a broad brush picture of what the post-COVID world should look like, in my view, starting, of course, with the caveat, which is that the notion that there will be a post-COVID world is still very blurred, very open. Like many of us, since the month of March, I spent a lot of time trying to devise in what the post-COVID world would look like. And the thing for sure we know is that it probably will take longer than we expected to reach this time horizon. So very broad brush, parameters, characteristic features of this world. I would say the bad news are that this world will be more divided, more complex, tougher, and international cooperation and governance will be more challenging. And the basic reason for that is that both geopolitics and geoeconomics play together, in increasing this East-West divide between US and China, which preceded, of course, the COVID crisis, but which this crisis has made worse because of clear excesses on both sides. We know that Trump is excessive, and that was confirmed during COVID. We know that Xi Jinping, as compared to a number of his predecessors, is also excessive, and this has shown during the COVID crisis, including with this big propaganda campaign by China, which backfired. Whether or not Trump or Xi Jinping, this rivalry is here to stay, with this sort of form of a new Cold War, because both of these big elephants feel vulnerable to each other. The US fear the power of China, and China fears whatever threat of Orange Revolution. The US threat is political for China, and the China threat is economic and technological for US, and this is to stay. And COVID has made it worse. This is not the only severe increase in fragmentation and division from COVID. The world post-COVID will also be more divided north-south for one simple reason, which is that half of the world economy roughly is under a big helicopter money distribution of roughly $20 trillion in order to offset the economic consequences of lockdowns. And this is true in Europe, this is true in the US, this is true in China, roughly, not to talk about Canada, Australia, and so on. But the other half of the world, which is roughly poor developing countries, is left in the cold with no possibility, like the one that can borrow public or central bank money at a 30-year maturity with negative interest rates. This is the privilege of only a part of the world, and the rest will suffer much more, so that as a consequence of this crisis, the economic development capacity of emerging countries will be relatively weaker, and the ones of developed countries will be relatively stronger, which will not contribute to the divergence, to the convergence we were all hoping for, and worse than that, will probably create divergences. So a tougher world. That's the bad news. There may be some good news in that this world will probably be in search of more sustainability, more resilience, and that global capitalism, as I see it, might exit in the post-COVID world slightly reshaped in a way that makes it less fragile, less speculative, and this would be the consequence of the 2008 crisis and of the COVID crisis. The 2008 crisis showed, for those of us who had not understood that capitalism is a volatile system, how damaging finance could be. The COVID crisis has shown how damaging the lack of proper precaution, sanitary-wise, in a number of countries has been, and this is a feature of the global capitalist system we live in. There will be a reaction to that with attempts to reach more resilience, with attempts to be better at caring about the environment. Not that it is the direct cause of the sanitary crisis, but because behind the origin of the sanitary crisis, people have understood that there is something that has to do with the relationship between mankind and nature. And this will, in my view, probably lead to a form of global capitalism which will be more resilient and less efficient, more sustainable, less risky, probably more environmental friendly, but of course the other side of the coin being that it will be less efficient in the traditional way we measure growth and profitability, which of course will interact with this context of global lower growth, which I mentioned, which is maybe good news for the environment, but which will be bad news for social inequality reduction, which again is an issue we will have to live with on many continents. What will be the impact on the global trade scene? This is one of the questions we are discussing today. I think overall, this big picture will result in a more challenging context for keeping global trade open. For at least two reasons, and in fact, three reasons. The first reason is the impact of this massive state intervention in the economies, the 20 trillion of public and central bank money, which I already mentioned, and which cannot not have a heavily distortive effect on the playing field. This will seriously impact the relative competitiveness of a number of players in global trade. And as we all know, WTO disciplines about state aids are extremely weak and this has been a problem for a long time. And of course, with such an enormous amount of public money, things will get worse. And re-leveling the playing field will be difficult and will take time. The second reason why the global trade scene will be more challenging is what I call the rise of precautionism. If you look at obstacle to trade globally, you have two kinds of obstacle to trade. The first one is what countries do to protect their domestic producers from foreign competition, and this is called protectionism. The second one is what countries do to protect their people from risks, and this is what I call precautionism. And I've said for some time already that the big problem of world trade regulation in the times to come will be less with protectionism and more with precautionism. And I think COVID will accelerate this move towards precautionism, which is protecting people from risks, safety, security, food, environment, health, and what have you. And of course, this is a much more complex field to regulate than protectionism. We've known to cope with protectionism for the last 20 centuries. It's about tariffs, it's about subsidies, it's about quantitative restrictions. You get rid of them and the job is done. We're not exactly there, but it's relatively simple. Leveling the playing field in terms of risks, precaution, is much more difficult because precaution, risk management is on a scale which is much more dependent on culture, on philosophy. It's a sort of scale between what's good and what's bad. And if you talk about GMOs or animal welfare or data protection, you have a much wider spectrum of collective preferences, which is difficult to address. And the third reason why the global trade scene will be more difficult and more challenging has to do with what I already said on geopolitics and geoeconomics. A more divided world, more polarized positions, notably by the US and by China, will make international trade cooperation, including WTO, more difficult. And we've seen this for the 5 or 6 last years, if not the last 10 years. So this is something which does not look good and which will necessitate a lot of efforts. Short word now about the EU position in all this. And I will very, very broadly tell you where I believe EU is going. On the global trade scene, it will slowly, too slowly for many of us, but rather consistently try to increase its international clout, not least to provide a sort of strong support to a multilateralism which is not in good shape following the US-China Cold War or trade spats. This is something which is rather new. The only area where EU so far has had serious international clout is trade, and the simple reason for that is it's the only area where it has a federalized, integrated, Brussels-run trade policy. This, as we know, is much less the case in other areas. But I think the COVID test has shown that the EU can cope with such a big shock as it did it in deciding on this big recovery package in July. And for all of us who are experts in EU integration, and Pedro was kind enough to rank me among them, this is a rather positive development. Even for many of us, a surprisingly positive development, given the amount of political energy it necessitated in recognizing a form of solidarity, sort of financial and budget solidarity, which was extremely measured before the crisis and which has translated this time into a big move forward. I would not go as far as saying, like some have said, that this is the Hamiltonian moment of the European Union. There's still a long way to go before the European Union becomes a sort of a federation, if this is the name of the game. But I think the EU integration will exit the COVID crisis in relatively good shape, although lots of problems will remain in the implementation of this huge 750 billion recovery package. I think this is a positive development. Whether this concept, which has been forged on the occasion of the COVID crisis in Brussels, of quote, open strategic autonomy, unquote, whatever that means, in fact, that the EU is getting ready to be more autonomous from US and from China, or at least not to have to take sides systematically in this US-China fight, siding with US in some areas and siding with China in other areas. The notion that both US and China are rivals and partners, but depending on topics or depending on moments, this is a navigation which will lead the EU not to systematically take side, is, I think, what it means, but it is affected this open coefficient, not least because in many areas, the DNA of European integration is about openness. Openness to trade, openness to people, openness to capital, openness to goods, openness to services. And this will not change, although one clear feature of the EU policy in general, which will translate on the trade side, is that the EU will get more green. This was true before the COVID crisis. As you know, the president of the Commission that was elected after the last year's European elections made the notion of Green Deal the strategic backbone of the next mandate of the Commission for the next 5 years. The COVID crisis will accelerate this and lead to a higher speed to this transition. That's one thing. And of course, on the trade side, this will result in a greener EU trade policy, including with a border carbon adjustment. And those of you who are interested in this topic can look at a series of briefs which the Institut Jacques Delors in Brussels has started publishing last year, and which I co-author with the boss of the Institut Jacques Delors in Brussels, which is called Greening EU Trade Policy. And we've published a series of briefs on how this should and will happen, including very recently a full-fledged template of what a border carbon adjustment should look like. Final point on the big picture, which has to do with my role as chair of the Paris Peace Forum. What we believe, and when I say we, it's both the French president and myself who launched this new approach to global governance in 2018. What we believe is that in this context, where international cooperation between states, between sovereigns, is more difficult, and this will remain the legal structure of the international system, we need other actors than governments, than diplomats, to enter, to engage, to support, to foster international cooperations. And this is about engaging companies, big academic institutions, think tanks, NGOs, cities, regions, on top of what diplomats do or do not do. And the reality is that, at least for the 10 or 15 last year, they haven't been able to do a lot. So it's not about replacing governments or states or sovereigns, they will remain, but it's about addressing the pitfalls of classical state-driven international cooperation in engaging other actors, and many companies, NGOs, academic institutions, think tanks, cities have now a power, a clout about international issues, which we believe we should leverage. And this is the thrust of what we are doing at the Paris Peace Forum, which I think was created clearly pre-COVID, 2 years ago, but which this, the edition which will take place mid-November, it's always mid-November because it started with the anniversary of the First World War armistice. So it's always, the event always takes place mid-November, and this year it's precisely going to be on how to revive multilateralism after COVID, which is very near to our topic today. So those were my few, again, broad brush remarks to introduce our discussions. Time now for questions and answers as agreed.
Pedro, you now lead the discussion.
Okay, I was getting in on mute. Pascal, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I wish you luck to the program of the very ambitious but very important at the moment and needed of the Paris Peace Forum. You're absolutely right. There are some COVID and the world post-COVID, which is much more serious than it seemed at first sight, because its consequences are the consequences of the response and the reactions to it will be with us for some time, a long time. And I like especially your views that say what we have been learning with the economic crisis, the last one, 2008, 2009, and this one, which is far more serious. This will be a disastrous year. So millions of people would lose their jobs, are losing their jobs. Millions of firms would fail. Millions of savings would evaporate, and so it will take some time for this reconstruction, so to speak. And there is a lesson there, which I think you emphasize, that we learn that the movements of the winds, the waters, climate, viruses, financial markets, they could be sometimes very disruptive, especially when they combine each other in certain moments of time. And there's a clear increasing demand for what you call the resilience, more sustainability. And you raise a very important questions about the extent to which this may affect the rates of growth and that we have been accustomed to observe in the past. So global growth, world trade was increasing twice the world growth for decades, elasticity of 2. The fall is very, very sharp now. And I want to have your comments on this question of these clusters that we are observing now, especially in industry. You have 3 big clusters in the world. You have China and Asia, so to speak, which, by the way, trade among themselves. The region, the intra-trade in Asia, is bigger than their trade in the rest of the world. The same thing applies to Europe, the second cluster. The intra-European trade is bigger than the trade with others. And if you consider the US, Canada, and Mexico is another, it is including increasing this intra trade interactions as well. This has an implications for the rest of the world and for international cooperation. We have now 8 candidates, if I remember, running for the World Trade Organization as future candidates. If briefly you could say how you see this thing evolved. And I have 2 more specific questions. Now I don't want to speak too much, to talk too much. One is that are we in, Pascal, come December this year, just approaching, for a non-deal Brexit, and how do you see the implications of a non-deal Brexit? All this discussion about fisheries and rights of truck drivers, British truck drivers in Europe, is going nowhere. Some of you could say something briefly about this implications. Of course, there will be questions which I'll leave Julia to ask you about how do you see the US relationship after the elections, whatever the outcome may be. Recalling that Trump destroyed the partnerships that the Obama administration was trying to build with the Trans-Pacific, with Europe, and the trade and investment partnership with Europe, the Paris Club Agreement, the prospects that you have of a new administration there, regaining these patterns of cooperation, alliances, NATO, and all that. If you care to comment briefly on that. And lastly, this weekend, Merkel is going to spend the weekend at Fort Brégançon with Macron in France. I think the last time this happened was when Helmut Kohl was there many decades ago. And I think that although I agree with you, the 750 billion euro package at current exchange rate is 900 billion US dollars. That's not a small thing. Was an important movement in the light of the previous refusal on the part of the Germans and others. So that you see this as an indication that in moments of crisis, Europe will try to make a new gradual step towards improving and consolidating the integration on which you yourself have invested so many decades since the 1950s. So I think that this is not a Hamiltonian moment in the sense that Hamilton took over all the debts of the 13 colonies after 1791, but it's an important movement out a package which has loans and grants and especially addressed to some more needed countries in the regions. I'm referring to Italy and Spain. So the first thing, I think you have this movement, and I hope this is a harbinger of things to come in the future if it is required. So if you comment on the specifics of these things that I mentioned, I would appreciate. Thank you.
Okay, good. Rapidly, first on your question about the WTO DG selection process. I will, as you can understand, not comment on the departure of my successor, nor on the new position which has been announced in recent days. What I can say about this selection process, and I have to keep my preferences for myself for obvious reasons, is that there is a good field of candidates, which I think is the good news. As we all know, WTO is not in a very good shape for a variety of reasons, and the fact that there are good candidates among the 8, including, by the way, 3 women who are rumored in Geneva to have a bit more chances of getting the job than the males who are competing, I think is good news. I think clearly in these tough times, the WTO needs somebody who has a lot of international experience, a lot of political experience, a lot of personal authority, although it is a member-driven organization and not a DG-driven organization. I have to remember that because when I transited from Brussels to Geneva, I was told I was leaving a member driving organization in trade, which was the European Commission, to land in a member driven organization, which is the case of WTO. And I can tell you, I can be very precise about what the difference is between being an EU Trade Commissioner and a DG of WTO. But let's say on this, there are chances for this selection process to lead to a good choice, which is what WTO undoubtedly needs. And the fact that the DG of WTO selection process is a reasonably rules-based one, something which does not result from dirty diplomatic combinations in some somber corridor with a dark horse coming at the last minute. The fact that this is done in the open, that you have to declare your candidate, you have to make your pitch, you have to campaign, there are several rounds of eliminations of candidates, is, I think, a feature, a model which many other international organizations could profitably emulate, in my view. Brexit. To put it very simply, Brexit is a British problem, period. The British people have decided 4 years ago that they would exit the European Union, which is the political decision. They simultaneously have decided they would exit the internal market of the Union, which is the economic decision. And they are now faced with the economic consequences of this political decision. The British, and I know this well because I've been working with them for decades in the European Union, were one of the biggest promoters of the internal market, i.e. totally level playing field in trade, free circulation of goods, capital, people, technology, everything, the nirvana of open trade. And the reason why they supported this was because it was efficient. And we all know it was very efficient. They decide to quit. They quit a space with no borders. And the economic consequence of that is that there is now an economic border. And why is there an economic border? There is an economic border because the name of the game for the British is that they now have the capacity to diverge from EU standards. And it took many, many years since the creation of the European Union, or at least the common market in the 1950s, to the disappearance of borders within the European Union in 1992. And the reason why the borders disappeared was because regulatory systems were aligned, either by harmonization or by mutual recognition. Now, the British leave the internal market, then there is a border, and the question is, how thick is the border? With the cost a border entails, and a thicker border is more costly than a thinner border. How much of a border will there be in the future? The answer to this question is it will depend on how much the UK decides to diverge from EU standards. This is an unknown answer. They've decided they could diverge. They've not decided how much will they diverge in pesticide residues, the size of bumpers, protection of birds, accounting rules, sanitary requirements, and so on. So Brexit is about whether this will be hard or soft, and the fact that there might not be a deal at the end of the day, at the end of the year, which I personally believe will be too costly to happen, although the result of the referendum showed that politics could prevail over economic rationality. What matters, I think, is not so much whether or not the border will be thick or thin. This is an open question, and only time will tell. I think the main issue is whether or not there will be a proper transition, because a large part of the cost of Brexit is due to sort of overnight changes which need to be done. And we all know that overnight changes are much more costly than changes that are that go with time. So the issue is not so much whether or not there will be a trade deal. The issue will be whether there will be time for economic agents to adjust to a transition, and this remains an open question. On US-EU, Pedro, I think, as I've said, the US-China rivalry will remain. It may take different shapes, it may take different forms, it may be tougher, it may be softer. In many ways, the EU-US relationship is a bit of the same, although in this sort of rival partner equation, we have many reasons to keep partnering with the US, not least sort of civilization-wide, and because of belief in human rights, democracy, accountability, political accountability, and so on. But the reality is also that geoeconomically, geotechnologically, EU and US are rivals, and that so far, at least in the knowledge economy, the US has been doing better than the European Union in terms of innovation, in terms of occupying the border of technological progress. That was not true 50 years ago. It's now true. So there is a sort of catch-up game which is to be done by the EU, and this is, I believe, perfectly doable in areas like artificial intelligence, for instance, the sort of the whole area of B2B digitalization. But there are also geopolitical issues, and we've had with the Trump administration this big political fracture about Iran. This is not a major economic problem, but the fact that the US exercise extraterritorial sanctions vis-à-vis Iran, which EU does not share, is a major dividing issue. And the assumption has always been on the EU side, the big question has been, what if the US do the same with China, thus seriously affecting the investment and trade relationship of EU companies with third countries? And this US extraterritorial sanction issue is the issue that looms over this US-EU relationship. And this is where probably there will be a difference between a Biden and a Trump administration, although as we all know, US extraterritorial sanctions have pre-existed. Trump had been there for a long time. The problem being that if it's a sort of low noise game, things can keep moving. The moment it becomes a higher noise game, then there will be reactions from the European Union, and in some Brussels quarters, people are seriously thinking about inventing countermeasures that would limit the impact of EU extraterritorial sanctions, including in measures that would affect US companies operating in Europe. Finally, on your question about Europe and the COVID crisis, Pedro, the meeting between Macron and Merkel took place yesterday. And I think Sérgio knows why it took place yesterday. They wanted to have this meeting before the PSG-Bayern football match, so that there would not be any interference and notably questions from the press on who should win. So they diplomatically put it just the week before this final. I think you're right, Pedro, that the July European Council did on the recovery package is a clear change of gear on the German side. They have de facto accepted Euro bonds. Now, the price for that is that we should not call them Euro bonds. Okay, we will not call them Euro bonds because the Germans don't like this to be called Euro bonds. But the fact that the EU as an entity borrows 750 billion on international markets under its signature and with its rating is a big step forward. Now, whether this will be repeated in the future is unclear. I deem that it is a big step forward. I am not sure there will be such a big step forward the next time we will need it, although I do believe that the EU integration process does not go back, but for Brexit. But Britain has always been a bit of a strange animal in the EU zoo. But I believe, to answer your question, that the EU integration process will keep moving. The question being not whether it will keep being moving or not. The question is how fast. And this is a big question in my view for the rest of the world, because depending on whether the EU can or should stabilize, contribute to revamping, reshaping, reorganizing a better form of multilateralism, will depend on whether or not it gains international clout. And as we know, this takes a long time. This is complex, but I think those of us who support European integration also support it because of the contribution it could or should make to a more dangerous world and a world in need of more international cooperation. And it's a reality that the European Union is a lab of international cooperation. As I've always said, and I've always been quoted in having said this, in my own professional experience, I've served in the French system of governance, which is solid. I've served in the world state governance at the WTO, which is gaseous, and I also served in the in-between space, which is Europe, which is liquid. And this liquid is a gaseous that tries to become a bit more solid, and I think this is how we should look at the future.
Thank you very much, Pascal. Sérgio, I give the floor to you.
I have many questions myself. Some of them reflect the questions asked by the public, but I think Julia has a question, and I would like to give the floor to Julia now.
Thank you, Sérgio. Yeah, I have a question that you already talked a little bit about China and US. It comes from a member of CEBRI, José Antônio Nascimento Brito. And I'll read the question here. Is the dramatic deterioration in the relationship between China and the US irreversible due to a clear anti-Chinese public opinion in America? And what changes if Biden is elected, or has the relationship been framed by Trump in such a way that has become irreversible? So that's a question from Joseph.
Can I piggyback on Julia's question and add another one which is related to the prior one? And my question is, how the dynamics of this increasing rivalry between China and the US can affect the very process of European integration that you've mentioned? That would be a relevant factor, or it is a negligible factor with regards to how the integration in Europe plays out in the coming future?
Now that's, of course, a very major question. On the first question, my own sense for what it's worth, and I mentioned it in my opening remarks, is that this US-China rivalry is here to stay for the next decades. So 10, 20, 30 years from now, this is the context we will have to live with. And the question is whether or not it takes a more confrontational shape or not. Confrontational in international relations is from a war of words, from diplomatic complications to the extreme, which is an armed conflict. I personally do not believe that there will be an armed conflict because I believe we've now reached a stage of economic, trade, and technological integration, which whatever attempts to deglobalize take place will be limited, and that the cost of a total warlike decoupling of US and China would be immense for both. Yet there may be in South China, there may be about Taiwan, there may be occurrences where this confrontation will be risky for peace. And we have to look at these various scenarios. And the fundamental reason, and I repeat it, is that they now feel vulnerable to each other. The Chinese leadership fears a political revolution, which will be triggered by foreigners, and the US fear that the dominance they've exercised on this planet since a bit more than a century will be at a cost for them, which they want to limit. Now, either Trump or Biden, this will not change. What will change is the way this relationship is geared, whether with a more Kissingerian-like attitude, which is we know that China will be a big power in the next century, and we have to manage this in such a way that this is not detrimental to US interest, or in a Trumpian way, which is China is a rival and we have to push back China. We have to damage China. We have to hit China such as China's rise is impeded, such as the rise of China is stopped by the US. And of course, these are very different scenarios. So what will change with the Biden administration, and I'm among those who hope for a Biden administration for a variety of reasons, is that it probably will go with a sort of more Kissingerian style, although the fundamentals will not change. The sort of Thucydidean fundamentals will not change. On Sérgio's question, my answer is clearly that this US-China rivalry is a sort of external boost to European integration. If you look at the support of EU public opinion in various EU countries to EU integration. The sort of medium long-term rate is 60+%. After the 08 crisis, this support decreased to roughly 50 or 50 minus after the 08 crisis. It's now back to a sort of 60 plus, and the various increases, when you look at the polls, have been thanks to Brexit, thanks to Trump, thanks to Erdogan, and thanks to Xi Jinping. This sort of notion that these are threats for the European Union, and by the way, this is a rather rational attitude. The whole of the crises which have hit the European Union for the last 15 years came from outside. Whether it's the 08 crisis, which came from the US, whether it's COVID, which came from China, whether it's the refugees, which came from the Middle East, all these crises came from the outside. And this notion of sort of open strategic autonomy, which, as I said, was forged in recent months, is a sort of conceptual reaction to that, which means that the EU will want to have an autonomy of choices. When do we side with the US? When do we side with China? According to our own values and interests, and not according to US pressures or Chinese pressures. And we have US pressures, and we have Chinese pressures. And this is an everyday reality. And I think this context, a sort of more divided, more fragmented, in a way more dangerous world, creates a feeling among Europeans that they better stick together. And at the end of the day, given the political system we have in Europe, whether EU integration will move forward or not is highly dependent on the support in public opinion about European integration. It may be more leader-driven or less leader-driven, and we clearly have with Macron, who's new in the job in a way, and Merkel, who's very old in the job. They both have good reasons to exercise leadership. Macron, because he's a deeply convicted European and he wants to move things. And Merkel, because she's on the way out and she wants to create, not least in the comparison which is inevitable with Helmut Kohl, a European legacy. So there are sometimes reasons where political leadership on the top may matter, but long, medium, and long term, what really gears the progress of European integration is support in public opinion, and external factors have already played a big role in this, and this is not the first time. Now, remember the roots of the creation of the euro. Now, the roots of the creation of the euro date from the reaction of European financial people, systems, politicians to the deconnection between gold and the dollar in the 1970s. It's an external element that triggered the first notion that, given this international monetary system, and Pedro is well aware of this, we'd better try and do something together. And that was the initial concept, which dated from the 70s, and that landed in 99 on the creation of the euro. So it's not the first time, but external factors do play a role. I have no doubt about this.
All right. Pedro, can I carry on?
Yes.
Well, in the last 20 years, there has been a lot of expectation with regards to emerging markets catching up with developed countries sooner than later, based on the premise that by reforming their economies, opening up their economies, they will be benefited by accelerated growth of trade and investment flows internationally. Do you think this story still holds? You've described a post-COVID world of growing divergence between developed and developing countries. And in this context, I would like to address to one region and one country. How do you see the future of Latin America? And how do you see the future of Brazil in this broad context?
Well, I believe this convergence, which you mentioned and which did take place. I mean, we roughly had a world economy growing, let's say, 3.5%, which is an average of 2.5 for the rich countries, 5 plus for poorer and emerging countries. This convergence will be slowed by the COVID crisis. Not least because of the huge amount of support which I mentioned, which will come for the rich economies and which is not available for poorer economies. Now, I will qualify my answer, Sérgio, because the notion that there is something like a homogeneous group of emerging countries, I disagree. China is China, India is India, Brazil is Brazil, South Africa is South Africa, Mexico is Mexico, Turkey is Turkey. Of course, they have things in common, but the notion that this is a group that has a sort of common attitude is, in my view, absolutely wrong. Although for political reasons, it may have been seen useful or comfortable from time to time, there is nothing like a serious homogeneity. So in order to answer your question, I think we have to distinguish country per country. China has its own course, India has its own course, and these are the two major elephants. Africa is still way from sort of normal average level of development. If you want Africa to 20 or 30 years from now to reach roughly the average of world GDP per head, you would need the African economy to grow by 10% per year for the next 10 or 30, 20 or 30 years. So this is a very specific case. And in the case of Latin America, I think Pedro said it all when he mentioned that this is a continent where the level of trade integration is extremely low. The only places where the level of trade integration is lower than Latin America is Africa and the Middle East, which, by the way, again, are not examples of thriving and comfortably, consistently moving economies. If you leave aside China and India, these economies will have been hit hard by the COVID crisis. This is the case for Brazil. This is the case for South Africa. This is the case for Egypt. This is the case for Turkey. This is the case for Mexico. Southeast Asian countries have been doing a bit better for a variety of reasons, which, by the way, are interesting, including countries like Vietnam, like Indonesia. As far as Latin America is concerned, I think as long as the level of economic integration will remain low as it is, the prospect for Latin America to join a convergence road with the rest of the emerging countries will be thin. We have this divide in Latin America between the sort of Pacific Alliance, open trade, Chile and friends on the one side, and Brazil and Argentina on the other side. And although there might have been changes, and we've had changes in the trade policy stance in Argentina, unfortunately, not resulting in macroeconomic success. We've had changes with the Bolsonaro administration, unfortunately, not resulting in macroeconomic success because of political considerations. So I think there is a sort of level of heterogeneity in the Latin American continent, which is still the reason why it will be lagging behind, including in bit like Africa, although in different proportions, given that they start from different levels of GDP per head, including in the capacity to move into the knowledge economy. And the problems of the future are very much with the digital world, which is a dematerialized economy, which will need a much higher level of knowledge, of innovation, of intelligence. And this is a huge challenge for training brains. And this is true for us in Europe, and where we have to catch up with the US and to some extent with China is in increasing our innovation and our sort of knowledge economy navigation capacity. And this is, of course, even more true for countries like Latin America and Brazil. As far as Brazil specifically is concerned, let me be very frank, there is a sort of political label with the Bolsonaro administration that takes Brazil outside of a normal international cooperation system. And we will see that, unfortunately, in Europe, with my expectation, and I'm afraid I'm not wrong, that, for instance, the Mercosur agreement will not be ratified anytime soon by the European Parliament because of the Brazilian stance on deforestation. This is the political impact it has, and on something like this, if I reason as a European, if I look at what people believe in different countries, if I look at where the majority in the European Parliament is, no way it's going to be the case. And by the way, I just saw in today's press a declaration by the spokesperson of the German government, who basically said exactly what I just said. We would like this agreement to be ratified by parliaments, but we don't believe it's going to happen anytime soon. And this is, I'm afraid, one of the answers to Sérgio's question. Whatever it means, and sorry for being undiplomatically frank, but those who know me know that I usually speak my mind.
No, I thank you for your very comprehensive and honest question. You've answered your comprehensive and honest answer. You covered a lot of ground and asked and answered a lot of questions here from Jorge Arbach, ex-minister Luis Fernando Furlan. And now I think I'm afraid we're approaching the end of our meeting. So I would like to turn it to Julia. She still has one question. And then Pedro for concluding remarks and concluding pending questions. Julia.
Okay, so last question here from Ambassador Graça Lima, who also says hi in his regards to you. His question is if you endorse the text of the Mercosur and European Union agreement to be soon forwarded to the European Council, and if you believe the text will be approved. Also, Minister Furlan, as Sérgio mentioned, he also asked the same question, and how long will take the agreement to be implemented, and if you suggest a roadmap. And they both say hi to you.
Let me be frank. I support this agreement, and I took quite a lot of hit in the French press when I did support it at the time when it was signed. And my main argument was that this was the right way to keep Brazil on the right side on climate change and environment. This was the sort of hook that would help a Bolsonaro-driven Brazil for the moment to keep within the Paris Agreement and to keep moving in the direction of addressing climate change. This was my main argument in favor of the deal. And this is the reason why I believe it's not going to be ratified anytime soon, because this argument does not work. People say, look, you told us it would help keeping Brazil on what we Europeans believe is the right side, and look at what happens in the Amazon. It's exactly the contrary. So you are wrong. This is something we should not accept. And this is why I keep supporting the deal, but I do not believe it's going to be ratified anytime soon. The notion that after European elections that took place last year, which basically greened the European Parliament, big side, this would be ratified in Brussels or in Strasbourg, no way. And by the way, among my various caps and engagements, I belong to the board of the European Climate Foundation, and we work a lot with Brazilian friends, including on addressing climate change issues, and there are still quite vibrant civil society organizations in Brazil, and we have discussions with them, which are very difficult because they tell us, we understand your problem, and we understand why you will not support, for the moment, ratifying this, but please, on the other side, do not drop the line. Because if you drop the line, we lose leverage vis-à-vis the Brazilian government. If EU says this Mercosur agreement is dead, we are lost in the sort of leverage which we try to exercise vis-à-vis the Brazilian government. So it's a very complex game. And my attitude, including within our deliberations in the European Climate Foundation, is we have to keep supporting the deal while not recommending its ratification for the moment, given what's happening in the Brazilian forest. And by the way, as we all know, and I'm sure Luis Forlan and Gracia Lima will agree with me, it goes much beyond the question of whether rainforest is destroyed in the Amazon. It has to do a lot to do with soja, it has to do a lot with animal feed, it has to do a lot to do with areas which in Brazil or Argentina, by the way, or elsewhere, go way beyond the Amazonian forest. But on this, I think it's a good agreement which will not be ratified anytime soon unless Brazil changes its stance.
Pedro.
To conclude?
Yeah, conclude. Yeah, basically concluding remarks.
Okay. Pascal, thank you very much indeed. I think it was an excellent presentation and very good replies to the questions you receive. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. There are 2 points I would like to make which are relevant to our discussion here in Brazil. One is the fact that you seem to imply, like many others analyzing the world scene, is that we are in for a period of, as far as global growth and global trade is concerned, for a longer period than originally anticipated. And this has implications for the some more divided world, more challenging, more dividing both across east-west and north-south, with the serious implications for the catching up hopes and expectations of the developing world, which is heterogeneous, of course, but many in the developing world, that the distance between the levels of income per head and levels of life style and patterns of income distribution and welfare could be reduced over time. The task is much harder now, has become much harder with COVID, and we know that other things like that will happen in the future as climate change emerged as a major issue to be addressed. And I would end up with an observation you made about Europe, which I think is very relevant for us here in Brazil and in the region, which is the following. You noted that the spirit that led to European integration was the reaction for two big wars in the continent in less than 30 years. So we cannot go on living like that. So that we started with a coal and steel community agreement in immediately after the war, and building up over time, despite many adversities, building up to the point that you reach the current situation. But I like especially two observations you made. First of all, the external difficulties emanating from sometimes from relationships with other countries, which I will name them, but the external difficulties reinforce the need to try to move ahead with European integration successfully, I would say. And the other thing that you insist, or it's very important, that the EU wants to keep the autonomy of choices. They don't want to be dependent or the one specific view of the world. There's patterns of collaboration, alliance, but retaining sort of European view, which is very important because you have a lot to say about how to build up these things under sometimes difficult circumstances. So there is a message, an implicit message here for us, that precisely when you're facing very serious challenges emanating from abroad and from within yourself, is a moment to try to stay together and to build something together, as you mentioned that the Europeans have done recently with this recent move. So thank you very much indeed on behalf of the CEBRI, on behalf of the Fernando Henrique Cardoso Foundation, and we hope we could have more exchanges like that in the future. Pascal, it's always a pleasure listening to you. Bye-bye.
Pleasure on my side.
Bye-bye.
Pedro asked also to mention you highly recommended Victor do Prado to be a fellow of CEBRI, and we have a new international trade program, and Victor will be the fellow.
As you know, Victor was one of my choices as deputy head of my cabinet. He was the deputy to the person who now is the Spanish foreign minister. So he has a brilliant career ahead of him, after all, and he's an extremely good guy, a perfect product of what Itamaraty used to produce best. And he's remained a very close friend of mine. So a guy I have in extremely high regard, and I think the WTO is lucky to have a guy like him in its governing team.
All right, and then a final statement. Allez, Paris Saint-Germain, allez.
Okay, I will transmit this to my friend.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you again.
Bye.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Bye. Bye all.